Cree communities and OG Cree communities, and it's important to recognize that this was their traditional land before we arrived. I don't have any conflicts to declare, and for those of you who are interested in anything that I'm about to say today, you can actually read it in a summary that we published in Current Diabetes Reports in 2015 with Alison Dart, who is the lady wearing the stripes on the right. She's a pediatric nephrologist, and Brandy Wicklow, who's a pediatric endocrinologist, the young lady on the left. So my first objective is to ask you to think about what we've done in the past and think about how awful that sounded, and resilient residential schools is an example of that, or how awful it sounds now, but how we thought what we were doing was right. And now think about what we're doing now and think about what we're going to consider in 10 years, or how we're going to consider in 10 years what we're doing now, and whether or not that's actually going to be false or inaccurate or unethical, for example. So this is a beautiful example. I love cycling. I love professional cycling. This is the Tour de France, the early 1900s. Two guys are helping their mate light a cigarette before they hit the mountains. Why is that? They thought that if you had a cigarette before you started climbing a hill, it would open up your lungs. Does that sound ridiculous? Yes. So what are we doing right now that could be as ridiculous 10 years from now? Because sometimes when we think we're really cool and we're doing the right thing, we look back in time and we're actually not as cool as we thought. So just as an example, I'd like to take us back 20 years. So in 1994, the average cost of a new car was $12,000. A liter of gas was 51 cents. A 4-liter of milk was $2.86. Do you remember what cell phones looked like? Okay. Things change very rapidly. And back in 1994, pediatric or endocrinologists in general thought A1Cs of 9 should be the target. Exactly. I'm glad I got a laugh. So we thought that was our best clinical knowledge. That was the right way to do it. After the famous DCCT, which was led by a Canadian investigator, we realized that if we target A1Cs that are lower than that, we can reduce a slew of complications. So that's now common practice. We look back 20 years and we think, wow, that was ridiculous. So what are we doing right now that we may think is ridiculous in the future? The second objective I'd like you to consider is jumping out of the box. You're all trained as dietitians or nutritionists. I'm always scared to use one word or the other. I don't know when I'm going to get slapped. But you're trained in a certain way. You've learned a certain amount of knowledge. David Sackett, who passed away this week, had a slew of famous articles, but a beautiful one he talked about was how trainees during residency will take the knowledge that they gain during their residency and use that the rest of their career. Rarely do they use evidence-based medicine to change the way they practice medicine. And currently, what you've been taught, you think is the gold standard. And I'm asking you to jump out of your fishbowl of what you've been taught and really consider something novel and something different when applying behavior change to Indigenous communities, especially when it comes to Indigenous youth. So the first one is diet and exercise don't work. So what you've been taught, that diet and exercise for youth with type 2 diabetes or at risk for type 2 diabetes, especially Indigenous youth, is not working at all. And so we need to change what we're doing because it's not working. If we take a look at systematic reviews, and here's an example for physical activity, looking at either community-based, school-based, clinical-based, home-based, population-based. Systematically, what we're doing for obesity is not working. We might get a 1, 2, 3 pound weight loss. None of that is very sustainable. And there's a reason why. When we look at what we're doing for youth, it's even worse. So nothing that we've ever done for youth is actually having any kind of significant impact and changing the way youth live. So we're going to talk about why that is. Some of you may think, well, John, you just published a paper in 2012. Your team got an award for it, showing that lifestyle and behavior change is key for the therapeutic management of type 2 diabetes. But I've jumped out of that fishbowl. This paper that we did was a chart review of youth that came through the clinic of Dr. Heather Dean and Dr. Liz Sellers over a period of 10 years. There was a small group of kids, maybe about 20% of the kids, 25% of the kids, that were able to make successful behavior change. They were able to lower their A1Cs to 7% and hold it there for a year, but none of them achieved weight loss, and we don't know how they ended up long term. But 75% of the kids were not able to use lifestyle at all to modify their type 2 diabetes and their type 2 diabetes risk factors. So the first one is physiological, and it has to do with insulin sensitivity and beta cell function, and I'll let you review that if you want to read the paper. But essentially in adults, there's a decline of beta cell function by 10% per year. In adolescents, it's more like 30% per year. So what we're doing is we're trying to improve insulin sensitivity, but beta cell function is so low that we're not going to make any measurable change in their blood sugar. So if you want a physiological rationale, that's it. But this is the bigger reason. When we take a look at youth with type 2 diabetes, there's a report that just came out in the journal JAMA Pediatrics, I believe. I tweeted it a couple days ago, so if you scroll through my Twitter feed, you'll be able to find the reference. But youth that are presenting to that clinic, 60% are living in poverty. The majority are admitted to psych at some point during their adolescence. 30% in our clinic have not completed grade 9. 65% have experienced at least one major childhood adverse event. And food insecurity, which we'll hear about later, we haven't even measured. But food insecurity is a major problem, especially for the youth in Manitoba that are being treated for type 2 diabetes, because they're coming from isolated northern communities where food is extraordinarily expensive. And so why would we focus just on their A1C when they're suffering from all of these other major issues in life, social determinants of health? The other factor that we don't consider, and we've published a methods paper on a novel cohort study that we've developed called iCare that's funded by the Canadian Diabetes Association, and fingers crossed it'll be funded by CHR in this coming round. Allison and Brandy are the PIs for this. When we measured mental health in youth with type 2 diabetes and we compared it to the national average, so these are mental health scores from youth of the same age across Canada, males and females with diabetes, without, white and non-white, you can see how across Canada it's fairly high, the average mental health score, and it's relatively the same across all youth. That bottom left bar that's blue, those are youth with type 2 diabetes. So their mental health scores are around 20% lower than the national average. Their levels of distress are twofold higher. And so youth are coming into the clinic, they're standing on a scale, they're getting their finger poked or their vein poked so that you can measure their A1C, but this is who we're dealing with. They're dealing with adversity, poverty, food insecurity, all of these other sources, and we're saying to them when they come into the clinic, all I need to know is your weight and your blood sugar and I'll make you healthy. If a child was facing all of this adversity and they bumped into you in the mall or in school, would you say, oh, let me see your blood sugar and I'll tell you what to do? No, you would focus on the things that matter the most to that child. And so take-home message number 2 is focus on the child, not on the blood sugar. Focus on the child and not on the body weight. Imagine what it's like for a child to come into your clinic and you show them a plate that says this is what your portion sizes should look like, and they haven't had any food in the house for the last 2 days. Do you think that's going to resonate with that child? No chance. So focus on the child, not on the physiology. So we learned a lot. I had to shift the way that I was taught. I'm a kinesiologist or a phys ed teacher by training, and I believe in physical activity. But when we sat down and talked to youth, and when Jackie Dumonte on the left there with the young lady with the sunglasses, when we were going into Dr. Dean's clinic and asking youth to live a more physically active lifestyle, to adopt more physical activity, it just wasn't resonating with them. Asking them to get off the bus one stop early and walk to school on a reserve doesn't work, okay? So we sat down and we did a qualitative study of youth with type 2 diabetes to say, what is it like for you to try to make these healthy behavior changes that your diabetes educators are asking you to make? And this is the framework that we came up with. So it was published in CJD last year, I believe. And so when we're taking specifically a look at healthy living behavior changes, we came up with a series of factors. The green ones were considered positive by children and moms and their educators, and the red ones were significant barriers. So if you take a look at this side here, this was the majority of the time was spent talking about these factors, and those are the social determinants of health. And that's what was driving their ability to make behavior change. You're not trained in dealing with social determinants of health, but I'll give you an example of what you can do in a minute. But if this is their major issue, this is something that needs to be brought up when they're in their clinic. The positive things, support, not knowledge. The kids had the knowledge. They needed the support to make the behavior change happen. And from a clinical side, having cultural relevance or a cultural understanding of what was happening for youth was considered a key supportive factor, but it was also a barrier. If someone wasn't First Nations, if they haven't worked with youth who were First Nations, they didn't really know how to interact. They didn't feel comfortable in that setting. And so we should look at things like this and supportive relationships, and we're trying to create systems or try to create environments where youth can make behavior change. We need to adopt these kind of things because that's what they're telling us they need. And most importantly, if adversity is the number one factor and the adversity of the social determinants of health, and I'll come to in a minute some of the other major factors facing Indigenous youth, resilience should be the starting point for us. And so resilience can be defined in many different ways, and there are many different theoretical frameworks around resilience. I love this picture because it exemplifies it really nicely. Something blossoming despite significant adversity. I think it's our job as healthcare providers, our job as intellectuals, if you will, researchers, scientists. It's our job to support environments, to create environments that support resilience. And so while many of those resilient theoretical frameworks exist, the one that we have adopted is the one developed by Dr. Martin Brokenleg called the Circle of Courage. And the Circle of Courage has 4 key elements: belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. And over the last few years, we've slowly developed the way that we think from a model that you might be familiar with, which is the socio-ecological framework that all of these different factors affect the individual, to one that's resilience-centered. And we built this off of Noreen Willow's model, which you'll probably hear about later this afternoon, where for Indigenous youth, in addition to the adverse factors that I described earlier, they're living legacies of forced assimilation, legacies of loss of cultural identity. In certain communities where residential schools were prolific, youth didn't know what was right or wrong. They didn't know if they should speak their language or not. They didn't know if their skin was the right color or not. And so that loss of a cultural identity is a major source of stress and adversity. Poverty, colonization, the lasting legacy of residential schools, and food insecurity are all major sources of adversity for our Indigenous youth. And so it's our job to create core principles, or support these 4 core principles of resiliency, and to create, in this case, school environments that support resiliency, that will reduce the inequities that we're seeing in type 2 diabetes and obesity in our Indigenous youth. So rather than go through some data, I'll tell you a story first. So we had a project that was a school-based project in inner city Winnipeg. It was called Beating Diabetes Together. We took the best framework for weight loss for children that had been developed and published. The first paper came out in JAMA. They had a 4-year follow-up in pediatrics. It was coming out of Yale University. Everyone at Yale's got to be smarter than us. So we just bought their booklet and we implemented it in the north end of Winnipeg and said, it worked in Connecticut. It's got to work in inner city Winnipeg. And so youth kept coming in, and it just did not resonate with them. We did structured physical activity that was fun. They liked playing the games. We had time together where we were bonding, but nothing that we were doing on the teaching side worked because they knew the information, they had the knowledge. What they didn't have was the support. So after about a year, we flipped it around and we said, let's just base this on the Circle of Courage and let's create opportunities to embody those 4 elements. So the first thing we did was belonging. All of our activities involved being together. They created their own Facebook page. They created their own hoodies. They created their own symbols and things like that. And so what they felt was this was a safe place for them to go. The majority of youth are feeling isolated, especially with diabetes. They feel blamed. Society's blaming them. They feel blamed when they come into the clinics. So this was a safe place for them to be and for them to talk. The other thing we provided was independence. We asked them, what do you want us to do? What do you want to learn? What are the things that you think are important to your development? And so they wanted independence. They said, well, let's go grocery shopping. You've taught us some of these things. We gave them $50 and said, let's go to the grocery store. You buy food for your family. You go home and cook for your family. A lot of the youth came in and said, we've actually never seen this many groceries bought in a single purchase. The second thing they wanted to build their resumes. So we implemented generosity. They volunteered for the summer. They went to different activities. This is right around Christmas time where they were selling things to raise money for the school. So they were giving of themselves, which again reduces a little bit of the noise and makes them feel a little more resilient. Here's a great example of belonging where the kids are all wearing their hoodies and getting together. And the friendships that they developed was the biggest source of positive out of this program. And then finally, mastery. They presented at the National Aboriginal Diabetes Association meeting a few years ago about what their experience was like living with type 2 diabetes. They did a little photo voice project to share what it's like for them as children and teenagers living with diabetes. They learned how to cook, they learned different skills, they took those skills back to their home. So we did implement things related to behavior change, but the framework guiding all of those things was the framework of the Circle of Courage. So to give you some science, we also implemented this in Garden Hill First Nation with the help of Larry Wood, the ADI worker, and Pinar Escajolo, a grad student. And we tested whether or not this program would work. So we've developed an after-school program called the Aboriginal Youth Mentorship Program. You can see it on Facebook. It's called /Rec and Read, where high school mentors are mentoring grade 4 youth through an after-school activity that's built around the Circle of Courage. And so belonging, the youth get together, they become mentors, they get their own symbol, they get their own t-shirts, they become a unique group within the school. We don't get the athletes, we don't get the valedictorians. We get the kids who maybe have one side inside the school and one side out, and we're trying to keep them in. So they create a group, they decide what programs they want to run, how they're going to deliver the program, and it's always led by youth. So youth that are relatively their age. And what have we found? So over the course of 5 weeks, when we delivered this program that included a healthy snack and included physical activity, included time for bonding, we found that those who were exposed to the intervention lost weight, those who were not in the intervention gained weight. We found that waist circumference also decreased, and most importantly, self-esteem went up. The youth are invited to present at several meetings throughout the year, and each year we try to get the youth together. So the last 2 days we had youth at our Pathways to Equity grant writing 2-day session, and it was the highlight of the meeting for the scientists that were there. Within the youth who are living with diabetes, we asked them to fill out a resiliency questionnaire when they come into our cohort study, and we found that certain aspects of resilience, or a total resiliency score, are associated with lower A1C, and components of that are more strongly associated with A1C than others. So in this case, the more mastery that a child has, the more that they feel they master their environment, the lower their A1C. And so, what are you going to do and how are you going to start? And I think one of the first places you can start is by looking at things like the conversation cards, where you put the power in the hand of the child to say, what do you want to talk about today? Here's a list of things that we could talk about: food security, friendships, isolation, exercise, diet. Where do you want to go? And you put the power in their hands. And I think that's the first place to start in terms of developing independence within a clinic, independence within that session. The second thing, as much as it's important for you to go to nutrition conferences and to go to the CDA conference, go to conferences outside. So there's a resilience conference in a couple weeks. It's held every couple years. This is the most dangerous phrase in the English language. We've always done it this way. So you got to think about jumping that bull. What's the most famous line from this movie? There's no crying in baseball. But actually the most important line in this movie is when Gina Davis comes into Tom Hanks and says, I want to quit, he says, what you're doing is hard. You want to quit because it's hard. The job that everyone has in this audience is very hard, but it's the hard that makes it special. If it wasn't hard, everyone would be doing it. So you should be proud of that hardness. And why do we do it? Because that's the generation that we're doing this for. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. That's a bit of a tough act to follow, but I think I can build on that. And I think the moral of John's story, if I may, is we should treat people like people and ask them what they think would work. And I think we'll get a lot further. And that applies to every population we work with, whether it be our students or maybe a unique population like First Nations or Inuit, or any other population, including obese children who live in urban situations. And I have to say that when you ask them what they think will work and they act on it, it actually does work. So I echo that very much. My talk is a little bit different from what John was talking about. I'm focusing a little bit more broadly on what are some of our health reports on First Nations and Inuit communities in Canada. I did include my disclosures there for you if that's of interest to any of you, but I don't think I have anything that would be considered a conflict of interest. So Aboriginal Canadians. I'm not sure exactly how many people would qualify as Aboriginal Canadian today. But if you look at the available statistics, which should be updated very soon, we have over 1 million people in Canada who are Aboriginal. And you can see on the left-hand side, I'm not sure if I can get around this poster, Mary Jo, with my pointer. On the left-hand side, we have total Aboriginal, and then we have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And quite a bit of my work now is focusing on Inuit, and the more recent statistics show that it's a very rapidly growing population and has now surpassed 60,000. So this graph represents 2006, and it's the most recent available graph from Stats Canada. It's a young population. Sometimes I think being young is great, but maybe not in the context of being a young population. Is it because people are not living longer, or because there's more people being born? And I think that when we look at First Nations and Inuit, it's probably because of both of those reasons. If you look at the left-hand side, that is men, and the right-hand side is women. And you can probably see that white bar for both sides is a little bit lower. And sometimes I look at it and say, it's a little bit lower. And being a scientist, you're used to looking at those graphs and you say, oh, well, it's not that much lower. But think about it. Those numbers, 64 years for an Inuit man is the life expectancy, compared to 79 in the rest of Canada. That's a long time. That's 15 years. And it's about the same for women, 73 versus 83, 10 years. Again, that's quite a long time. When you look at the numbers for First Nations, it's not as discrepant, but still the numbers are lower for men and women who are First Nation status. Life expectancy is lower, and in some ways, when we listen to John, maybe quality of life is something we should focus on as well. So age-standardized rates of self-reported health are something that maybe we should be looking at more closely, and looking at how this is changing over time. And is it changing over time because of diagnoses, or is it changing over time because of true differences in the population? And some of that I don't have an answer for you today, but we can ask our friends from Stats Canada if they're here in the audience. So perceived to very good health is higher in non-Aboriginal Canada compared to the rest, and having one or more chronic health problems seem to be the lowest in the Inuit. And I think we've known for a long time, there's a lot of information in our textbooks, that the Inuit have for a long time been very resilient, have had very good health, a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, etc. So when you see that number that I've circled, you might say, yeah, I'm not surprised about that. Well, this is data from 2007, 2010 from the Canadian Community Health Survey from Stats Canada. And there's been some more recent data added that I'll get to about halfway through my presentation on the Inuit. Now, I left this blank for you. I was toying with the idea of getting you to stand up. If you thought, after overweight and obesity, what would be the next pressing healthcare problem for Aboriginal Canadians and the rest of Canada, non-Aboriginal Canadians? If I said, do you think it's diabetes, would you all stand up? Just put your hand up and then look around the room. So actually not as many of you, I don't know if you're shy or not, but go ahead, put your hand up. It's okay if you think it's diabetes. So probably about maybe a quarter of you are thinking maybe diabetes might be one of the most pressing healthcare problems. And keep in mind, this is self-reported, and in order to be self-reported, you have to have had a diagnosis. So here's the rest of the graph. Arthritis is next for most of Canada, asthma, and then diabetes. Now, some of you in the audience will say, yeah, but that's self-reported diabetes. It's not measured diabetes. Maybe it's not consistent with other regions that weren't surveyed. So as wonderful as our health measures surveys are, I love them, I think they're fabulous, they don't necessarily reach all of our populations, especially in the remote regions of Canada. The one thing I want to draw your attention to are the bottom two lines as well. So food insecurity is very high in our Indigenous populations in Canada compared to the rest of Canada. And what we don't know is osteoporosis and fracture. We don't have good measurements on that. The only time we've looked at that in our own surveys in Canada, in more urban Canada, is in the 2009, I think it was 2 months of the 2009 survey. I'm getting the nod, good. And this is probably not reflective of the remote regions in Canada, but the numbers are quite high. 10% having osteoporosis and 8% having had a fracture after the age of 40. So this doesn't include sports injuries as a child, for example. example. And I think that's really great that we have this data to put things into context. You know, what are some of our pressing healthcare concerns in Canada, and how can we address these together with the various communities where we feel there is a pressing need? So Aboriginal Canadians have also been surveyed in the rural health study. And in this slide, I've circled the rate of obesity being quite high, 40% in First Nations off reserve. And if we look at type 2 diabetes, you see there 17.2% for the prevalence of that. We don't have good numbers for the Inuit in the far reaches of the north. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story, if I can, since we're storytelling today. A little bit about when I worked here in Manitoba. When I was introduced by Dr. Atkinson a few minutes ago, when she said from Hope Weiler from McGill University, I almost corrected her and said, Manitoba. I feel like I'm at home since I worked here for 9 years. When I was here, you know, we had a lot of discussions as to how do we look at bone health in First Nations communities. The reason we wanted to do that is that my good colleague, Dr. Leslie from St. Boniface, had looked into the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy and Evaluation records and noticed that fracture rate, this is non-traumatic fracture rate, was more than double. You'll see that on the left-hand panel of the slide in First Nations men and women. And he's also more recently noticed that this rate's even higher if people have diabetes. It's also true whether we think of all fractures, osteoporotic fractures, or just the hip fracture, which is, of course, the most troublesome in terms of survival rates and repair. So he worked with the communities very closely. I was very fortunate to have that collaboration and really worked from the ground up. What can we do? Who wants to participate in this work? What's most feasible? And where can we start? And so there's been excellent buy-in with the AMC here in Manitoba. So what I'm showing you next is a little bit of the data from the First Nations Bone Health Study Phase 1. And for this particular study, we were only looking at adult women, and you can see on the bottom of the slide here the ages. So we have about 43 on average for the rural First Nations, a sample of 26, urban First Nations 146, and urban white 184. The First Nations women, they were all identified through the communities. They were all having registration status. You'll also notice their body mass indices were quite high, on par with what I just showed you for the health surveys. And the percent obese, I didn't calculate it for the small group of 26, but 48% obese in the First Nations group that we studied here in Manitoba a few years back. So this is only 25 to 76 years of age. When we looked at some of the possible nutritional linkages with higher rates of fracture, looking at bone mass in the next few slides, we really zoned in on vitamin D and calcium, which are the traditional things we think about. And what we can clearly see here is that vitamin D status was indeed lower in the First Nations women who were rural, slightly higher in those who were urban, and then much higher in those who were urban white. And you can see the dietary intake on your right here. Wasn't much different. This is by food frequency questionnaire. And the sources were a little bit different based on the group. But as a total, the numbers looked very similar. When we look at the proportion of those who were in status above 50 nanomoles per liter, which is our suggested cutoff from Health Canada and the Institute of Medicine to support bone health of populations, you can see that 31% of the rural group met this, 50% of those in urban Winnipeg, and then looking at the white group, it was more at 65%. And on the bottom right, I've shown you how many servings of fluid milk would be consumed by these groups, and you can see the numbers are quite different, isn't it? So for those who were in the rural range, 17% might consume the 2 servings of fluid milk a day. And when you look at those who were rural, 38%, and those who were urban white, 70%. So it just shows you a really big difference in the numbers. And whether this is ascribed to food security, food availability, or some other reason was unclear in our study, but it does beg the question, if we think that the vitamin D status is contributory to fracture rates and low bone mineral density, then we might want to look at food security in our next steps. So we needed to look at the bone health. How do you do that in remote regions? You can't drive to some of these regions, you have to fly in. So we had portable equipment, we call it the PIXI for short, which is a peripheral instantaneous X-ray imager, and you can get forearm bone mineral density. It's about 70 pounds. You can purchase a seat on an airplane for it and take it up to the communities, and that's what we did. And for those who are in inner city, we also did the regular densitometry tests, whole body, spine, and hip. So here's the data for you. I've only shown you 3 rows. The calcaneus, the radius, and the total body values for bone mineral density were lower in First Nations. And the values for the total hip, femoral neck, and the lumbar spine, the p-values were pretty close, but they weren't significant, 0.08, 0.09, 0.06, etc. But definitely following the same pattern. And when we started to look at some of the correlates of this, because it's just cross-sectional data, then what came out of this was not so much the nutrition or the vitamin D status, but some other biomarkers further along the metabolic pathways. And what we found is that those who had higher osteocalcin, which is a bone formation marker, which might have linkages as well to pancreatic function, when it was higher, then the bone mass was lower. And the same was true for parathyroid hormone, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. So recently, we've had a chance to look at the First Nations Bone Health Study 2. So this part is not published. The other slides were all based on published data. And what you can see here in the graph is when we went to only rural Manitoba, Thompson and Ashern, and we looked at First Nations women compared to non-First Nations women from the same community, then you can see as we go across the age groups that, oh, I beg your pardon, I got the wrong button. When you look at the younger group, the numbers aren't too different. When we start to see the older group, 40 to 59, the numbers are both going down for Z scores for bone mineral density of the forearm. And then when we look at those who are over 60, we see quite a difference here in First Nations women who are over 60. So we need to look a little bit deeper at this data. I think vitamin D is going to be part of the story, but only part of it. And we'll have to go through our next steps and look at what we can do with the communities, see what they would like to do, and maybe improve bone health as well as some other health outcomes while we're at it. So now I'm going to turn to the Inuit Health Survey and give you a little bit of information as well on bone health. So going back to the slide I showed you at the beginning, I've combined that with the Aboriginal Peoples Survey that was just released last year. And I think for the First Nations, the data set's now available as of March or May, if you want to look at the First Nations data, but it's not yet compiled as a report. So looking over time now at the Inuit population, we have here on your left the CCHS from 2007, 2010, and then the Aboriginal Peoples Survey for 15 years and up. And you can see now that the number who are saying they have very good to excellent health has gone down. Maybe we're assessing it better. Maybe there's more awareness. The number who are saying they have one or more chronic health problems seems relatively stable. And in some ways, this could be because there is a higher proportion of people in the Arctic who do not have medical care or expertise. I think it's something like 14% will say they have no access to a physician or a nurse, compared to the rest of Canada, which is lower at maybe 10%. The rest of the numbers seem very similar. For the Inuit health surveys done by the APS, you can see that we have a little bit more confidence now. The E's are gone. So for arthritis, asthma, and diabetes, the numbers are the same pattern, but the numbers are a little bit different. And high blood pressure is a little bit more common. Mood disorders and food insecurity is again much higher in this group. The problem with this region is it's very hard to go there and have health measures surveys. And again, when I moved to McGill, I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Grace Eglin, who had the insight to develop the Inuit Health Survey of 2007-2008. And this population was looking only at 18 years of age and over, and covered all of the official regions in the Arctic. only looking at those who were of Inuit status. So this is 54 latitude north and above, and you might be able to see on the map all the communities that were visited. In red was surveyed in 2007, so all of Nunavut, almost all of Nunavut, and then we surveyed the other regions in 2008 and finished up a little bit of Nunavut as well in 2008. So who did we sample? We had 2,796 people agreed to participate. Not all of them were able to provide a blood sample for logistic reasons. And in the end, for the assessment I was involved in, which was vitamin D, we had 2,168. This was only summer, fall, so those of you who are vitamin D researchers know that that's probably when vitamin D status is at its highest due to sun exposure. We had a little bit of an undersampling of men. Only 39% were men, and partly this is because they were hunting, fishing, etc., and not available. The age on average was 42, BMI 28, similar pattern as the rest. And thinking about vitamin D and supplements, only 8% would take a supplement. The vitamin D intake is quite low unless they're consuming traditional food. And the vitamin D status, which is a weighted status, is 58.8. So it's a little bit lower than the rest of Canada. Here's a graph of some of the data for you. We can see here that as people get older, as we look at older people, they have better vitamin D status than the younger generation. So we have a different pattern happening. Young people have a different lifestyle, and I think we need to design our surveys to really talk to each age group and what do they want to get out of the next surveys should they occur. You'll see on the right-hand side the pattern is the same for women. When we look at who's at risk for low vitamin D status, we see that generally it's people who have higher waist circumference, and that's shown in this graph, and this is published data if you want to look at it in more detail. There was a trend for having a hunter in the home as being protective as well, and there's been some of the research we've looked at where vitamin D status isn't necessarily only about vitamin D status, that it seems to be a marker for food insecurity and for metabolic health at the same time. So sometimes I think about my research as a pure vitamin D, but it's also a bit of a marker for other problems that are happening. We also took our PIXI up to the Arctic on the research ship, and we measured only women over 40 years of age, not men. And you can see some of the values here. In the third line is the bone mineral density. You can see the density is lower with advancing age, which makes sense. And on the other hand, vitamin D is higher with age. So in this case, it's clearly not just about vitamin D. We also know that type 2 diabetes goes up with age, and you can see that quite prominent in this subgroup of women we studied. And when you look at the fracture, any fracture, it's actually fairly flat across the population. So one of the things I wanted to include to match up a little bit with the First Nations bone health study was looking at osteocalcin and parathyroid hormone, etc. And you can see here in this slide that osteocalcin has an inverse relationship shown here with the bone mineral density in these women who are over 40 years of age. And again, what is that a marker of? Is it just of bone health, or is it also of some possible function in the pancreas? We'll have to look further. So my summary is here. Basically, we know that there are higher rates of obesity in First Nations and Inuit populations. We know that the rates of type 2 diabetes are climbing, but we also know that there are a number of other health problems that we should be addressing, and that we maybe should be moving forward in more holistic ways, working with the communities, asking them what do they want to look at next, and asking them how do you want to look at this next. We've had some discussions about our next Inuit health survey, and many people in the academic world will ask me, how are you going to fund that? And I say, I don't know. Let's talk to the communities and see what do we want to do first. And I talk to the communities, and they say, well, let's first reconsent, and then we'll get to that. And let's go back and look at the data we have now and answer a number of really important questions we haven't seen answers to yet, and that maybe we should be working on that before trying to go ahead with the next survey. So I think treating people like people is the way to do it, with respect. Everybody knows their own history the best and might know the context of how they live much better than I could ever envision. So I think that bone health is an excellent example of how you can work with communities, you can think about what's important to them, and then in the process, you might also be addressing other health problems too. So with that, I'll just leave you with the acknowledgements from both of the studies, with those in Manitoba as well as those in the Arctic. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, just a little bit of background, knowing that in a little bit we're going to have more speakers in this area, and then talk to you a little bit about a project that my community in Prince Edward Island, our First Nations community, has named Food is Medicine, and I'll explain to you why that is, and I hope I do this right. Found this graphic in a wonderful report. The reference is at the bottom there from Vancouver, and it was actually talking about the track that, since sort of the early 1800s right down to the present, what has happened in terms of the food systems that Aboriginal and First Nations have participated in or have had. And as you can see, going from early on where land and wildlife and fish and all that kind of thing were very plentiful, right through to, heavily influenced by market foods and residential schools, of course, which we've also had the same problem in Prince Edward Island, that what we've ended up with is, higher levels of food insecurity, and something that really, from a dietetics point of view, we've only really started talking about probably in the last 10 years or so. Would that be accurate, Fiona? That food sovereignty, the whole idea of having control over your food system, which was just the norm in the past, and sure as heck isn't the norm now. And I won't go through this, but we know, obviously, that food insecurity is a huge issue. And if we're going to try to tackle some of these issues around diabetes and obesity, certainly this is a main one. What's happened, that was supposed to have some animation on it, but it's not there. What's happened, of course, is that because of the changes to the food systems and because of poverty and food insecurity, big surprise, we've seen changes to diet, and we've seen higher levels of obesity and diabetes, and that again has been already discussed. And there's been efforts made. There's a wonderful poster here coming out of Health Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada, looking at educating about the importance of traditional foods, that they're healthier, and the whole idea of what John was getting at. If you just tell them. And in defense to my profession, we have been lacking in looking at social determinants, and we have had the idea, and I say this to my students all the time, if we could just put a memory stick in their head with all the knowledge that they need, surely everything would be all right. But there is a strong movement in dietetic education to try to do a better job there, and I think we're all nodding there, but we do have some work to do. So the problems, and again, this is not to take away from some excellent work that's been done, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, where we've tried to go in and we've tried to provide information, all the things John was referring to, whether it's what to eat and how to exercise and that kind of thing. A lot of individual approaches. We're lucky enough in PEI, we have 2 dietitians. We only have 2 reserves. We're tiny. And there's a dietitian in each one of those reserves that the Band Council funds. And they do a lot of, education about what to eat and food skills and that type of thing. The problem is, and there's been many excellent researchers, health researchers, that say, for Indigenous work, we need to look at the root causes, and that's already been raised. But it's even looking at the causes of the causes. In other words, you can't just say food insecurity is the problem and it's leading to diabetes and obesity, but why are they food insecure? Which gets at that classic social determinants approach. Certainly, if you look at major reports, and again, I dabbled in this literature as we prepared a grant for the first part of this competition, And one of the things that we want to do is to do a better job of looking at what's already out there, because there's, I am quite humbled by the excellent work that's been done to say that there's a lot of people coming to the same conclusion, which is that we really have to use a different approach, and that participatory approach and respectful approach, and having it coming from the community instead of from a, kind of a do-good, non-emergental researcher is obviously the way that we need to go. So the other big thing that's always been a passion of mine, I always say when I'm in foods and nutrition, the food is the big one coming before the nutrition, and looking at the food environment, which I'm going to touch on in a moment. But that's certainly another piece that, yes, the poverty issue is there and food insecurity, but part of not having food sovereignty is not having good food that you have control over. And so looking at that food environment is a piece. And the other one, which is way outside my comfort zone, is economic development. If you want to look at changing poverty, you've obviously got to look at some mechanisms to do that. That people have to have more money in their pocket and the knowledge and the ability to make good choices. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about and perhaps this is inappropriate because I'm saying my community, but I really do feel that I've been welcomed into that community to do some work. And as I said, I've done one other project, so they certainly didn't come on my pedigree. They may have contacted me knowing that poverty's been an issue on my mind and in my volunteer work for decades. So the Mi'kmaq First Nations is basically is made up of 4 different areas in the province. The largest one is Lennox Island, but you're still talking about a very small population. And then there's 3 other areas in blue. You can see right here. Oops, hit the wrong button. Back we go. So there's Scotchford, which is where Chief Brian Francis is, and Lennox Island. So those are the 2 main ones, but there's 2 smaller reserves as well in the Charlottetown area, Rocky Point and Morel. So these reserves basically have come together and formed the Mi'kmaq Confederacy, which is, basically it's a compilation of both, and they have health workers and they have business development workers and that type of thing. And look how beautiful it is. Lennox is absolutely gorgeous, and Scotchford as well. Now, mind you, you wouldn't have gone there in February this year because you wouldn't have been able to see anything but white. And that was the true for the whole island. But as you can see, for Lennox in particular, that is, let me just go back here. It's an island, and there's a little causeway, and it's quite isolated. Even Scotchford, even though it's only about 25 minutes outside of Charlottetown, it's still more difficult to get to a good grocery store from there. And one of the things that I am quite fascinated in, and the people that I've talked to, particularly the chiefs, and this isn't unique to PEI, is how can we get back to where we were? We were so much more healthier. We didn't have as much chronic disease. How can we go back to the things that we do? And the problem, I think I just missed a slide here. No, maybe not. The problem with the traditional foods, you would think shellfish and blueberries and things like that. Some of the traditional foods that have become very popular, if you go to a powwow, and I've been to a few of them, something that they call Indian tacos. I don't know if you probably, yeah. So they're deep fried with ground beef and cheese and stuff like that. They're kind of a nutritionist nightmare. But, it's interesting to me because the kind of perspective that we have in our profession is that, more whole grains and more fruits and vegetables and cut down on the fat and that type of thing. But Roseanne Sark, who's one of the members of the Mi'kmaq Confederacy, said to me one day, I was talking about traditional foods, and yes, that, who's going to disagree with that? We should get more traditional foods being consumed and grown and that type of thing. And she said, do you realize that the traditional foods for us, since residential schools, is white sugar and white flour and baking powder and salt? And I was speechless because she said, that's how we make Luskinnigan, which is like a bannock. That's what we had. Those were the rations that we had. And it did give me a different perspective. Oh, this slide was supposed to come first. There we go. So, the traditional foods are the ones that you can think about, lots of lobster and blueberries and eels, which are very, very popular, and, fishing and high energy and all that going on. Same thing as in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where the Mi'kmaq also are. So 2 levels of traditional foods, which I thought was interesting. And then, of course, comes the market foods, and this is something that we see a lot of in all the communities across the country, and PEI is no different. The availability, if you look on the reserves, there is a gas bar, where they sell gas, and there's lots of chips, and there's lots of pop and things like that, and obviously fast food and soft drinks is another major thing. So if we're looking at that nutrition transition, which leads to more chronic disease and diabetes, we have to look at what's available in the communities. So my one foray into this particular area of research is with this red-haired girl that the Mi'kmaq community called Red-Haired Roberta. And we basically did a study on health perceptions in Mi'kmaq children, which was very interesting. And it was a qualitative study, and one part of it was I was kind of the token nutrition academic, and we looked at their food intake. And published this paper a number of years ago in Journal of the American Dietetic Association, just saying that, yeah, they were low in milk and they were low in fruits and vegetables, but it was very similar to a study I'd done on about 2,000 kids in PEI, very similar levels. The really big difference was that they were twice as likely to have French fries every day. And I remember that just kind of struck me, like, why would you have French fries every day? And one of the people in the community said, they're going down to the gas bar. That's where they get the fries, or they're having them at home, like frozen French fries. That stuck in my mind. When we look at PEI, all of PEI, the most recent figures, just got them last week from Valerie Tarasuk, and we're up to about 16.2%, going up every year. But we have no particular data on PEI First Nations. We're too darn small. So I talked to my buddies at StatsCan. We're always the E on the chart. We never have enough numbers, right? And it's very frustrating, because I know from doing advocacy work in food security, in PEI, in non-Aboriginal communities that, you got to have local numbers. Politicians in small places, they're not interested in having numbers as good as they are from another community. The other thing we know, too, is that if we look at, the consumption of traditional foods, we know it's certainly lower than we would expect, but we don't have any idea. We intuitively know it's low, but we don't have any numbers on that. We had a number of great publications coming out looking at the determinants of healthy eating in Aboriginal peoples, and also looking at what are some of those risk factors that lead to food insecurity, and they're what you would expect, not having a home, being a single mom, and being low income, and not having an earned salary, and that type of thing. And what we do know, and I underline the local level just for my own benefit here, but we do need to identify what's underlying these choices, because it isn't a simple matter of, we're pretty sure that Mi'kmaq kids like French fries better. There's something going on there. No, there's other things going on around availability and income. So I don't need to go through all of this, because Dr. Atkinson already did, but I had a fascinating conversation one day. A young woman showed up in my office, January 2014, and said, there's money available at CIHR to do some research in First Nations and Aboriginal communities, but we need a university. Will you do it? And I said, sure, whatever, I'd love to. I thought that's a great idea, and really didn't think a lot about it. And then they chased me. So it actually was different. Normally, the other project I worked on, we were driving up to Lennox, would you like to work with us, that type of thing. So that was a new experience for me, and I have to say it has changed the whole tone of the research for me, because they had the idea, and they asked me to participate along with some other researchers. So I am definitely the thorn between two roses here. Chief Matilda Ramjatan, who we just call Chief Matilda, and Chief Brian Francis. Chief Matilda actually, when we were writing the grant, said that she wanted to be co-principal investigator. She is not a token, First Nations chief on my team. and I get text messages from her on a regular basis about what we're doing, and she's certainly very involved. Chief Brian has a different community and different priorities, and I think it's going to be quite fascinating to see how things work out. We also have 3 people from MCPEI, one of whom is a former student of mine, who's a dietitian, and Alma and Roseanne are both very, very active. Alma actually works specifically with residential schools and is going to work on the cultural competence issue in our team. The 2 other academics, Dr. Debbie Martin, some of you may be familiar with at Dalhousie, and Bill Montalpere, that works with me, have really rounded out the project. So this is the group that came together about a year ago. What was interesting to me is that I come into food security with, okay, we need to have good quality food, fruits and vegetables, and, they need to drink more milk, all the classic nutrition messages. And a couple of the first meetings we had, the people around the table that were coming from the community said, we've really lost a lot because our grandmothers used to know, how to cure us, and it could be stomach ailments from, it could be looking at everything from, ground spruce right through to bog cranberries, and you can see there's a lot pictured here. And she said, we don't do that anymore. And there was this little voice inside my head saying, well, I know, but that's not probably going to help their nutritional status a whole lot. And then I thought, Jennifer, give your head a shake. Like, that is not what this is about. This is one piece of what they want to do, and it means a lot to them. And I said, okay, whatever you want to do, we will explore that part of it. And that's where they came up with the name for the project, Food as Medicine. I did find, that says Food as Medicine. I did that on purpose, because taking food as medicine. But the project was named by our First Nations team members to capture that. So our objectives, I added the strong, trusting relationships because I really feel that the first project that I worked on, I wasn't PI on it, and mistakes were made. Meetings were rushed. Sometimes the consultation looked like it was consultation, but there was some preconceived ideas of the way things went. And so I have had to do a bit of damage control, which I wasn't even aware of, which has been a lesson to me. But certainly the trusting relationships are very big. We are going to add more researchers to the team, so if you're interested, it's going to be a great project. But we do have a number of people in mind that we're going to be approaching. We have to decide what is going to be success, and I think that's where I have to put my preconceived notions as a nutritionist in the back, for sure. We're going to do a best practices review. We are going to do a number of consultation visits. We already plan to go to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, because, it's just go across the bridge, get on the ferry. It's not that far to go. Chief Matilda, being Chief Matilda, has already contacted a chief in New Brunswick and is planning to pull them into our project, which I think is a great idea, because we are tiny, and it's easy to do things when you're tiny, but sometimes it's really hard to get enough numbers, and publishing data and things like that can be a challenge too. Obviously, at the end of this part, which I have to thank CIHR, because I wouldn't be doing this project if we didn't have this first round. Because I can't compete with the people that are at the table and the people that are at other tables in the room, because I don't have that track record. But I can build a team and design a project with our team. And so I'm very thankful to have that first component. So the time frame is rather obvious, but I already mentioned about the initial approach. But the kinds of things in this component one, I already mentioned the consultation and things like that, but one of the things that we are hearing very clearly from the communities is that if all we're going to do is talk about what we're going to do, we don't want to do this. And I said, well, that's kind of hard, because you get money and we're supposed to, write the grant and consult. But there's a very strong need to look at some things that are already being done and consider them pilots, and to see how they're doing and trying to get a handle on that. Obviously, the full proposal, that's going to be around September 2016 is roughly the time frame that I'm going on. The approach that we're using is something that was suggested by Debbie Martin, who's done some work in this area, and it certainly has come out of a group in Nova Scotia, and that is the two-eyed seeing approach. And it's the idea of bringing together what I was just talking about, which is a Western scientific knowledge, the so-called academic approach, but valuing equally the indigenous ways of knowing. And certainly I'm not an expert in that area, but that is an approach that I know that our partners in our First Nations communities are very much embracing and feeling is appropriate. So I have to show you, so the Lennox Island Sacred Garden is something that Chief Matilda has started, regardless of this project. I can take no credit for this original one. She did this on her own. And it's one of the things that we want to build on. And as you can see, this little one here has a cup with her picture on it, and they're planting seeds. So they're already involving youth. So that's what I mean by looking at pilots and how they can work. Another thing that's quite interesting, if you take a look at the picture, this is roasted salmon and wild blueberry butter sauce. And this was done by a student at the Culinary Institute of Canada for one of the First Nations communities, and it was sent to me 2 days ago. And I looked at it and I said, man, that looks delicious, but really, I don't know if the wild blueberry butter sauce is something that's necessarily going to be practical or affordable. But I think it's a good example of, yeah, you can do great things with traditional foods, but you have to make it practical. Just wrapping up, this is a bit of a model of where we're going, which is how we're going to try to address those health inequities and make a difference. And one of the things that I feel so strongly about is that we have to do something in terms of economic development if we're going to make a change in these communities. We can give information, we can do community gardens, we can do food skills and that type of thing. But as John started this with, is that you also need to figure out what they need, and a lot of what they need pertains to their economic status. So we're going to have 2 working groups where we're going to have economic officers on each of those to try to figure out what the community wants to do, and it could be anything from, flash freezing lobster in brine and selling that. So trying to bring more money into the community through the food projects, and that's going to be a challenge for sure. I did want to just put this up for a minute. This is Chief Matilda. I was actually looking for a picture of something else, and this popped up from just late last fall. And it was her making a comment about the Campaign 2000 report card, which came out. And she's in the newspaper with a picture. And she certainly has been quite a strong advocate. And this is a quote from her, which we actually put in our grant. The memory is there with our current elders, but it's going to go fast. When I talk to her, I can feel her urgency, that if we don't do something now and work with our elders, we're going to lose the information that we have left in terms of food as medicine, but also just in terms of traditional ways. She said this grant must do is create self-sustainability for our community members in the wake of high unemployment here in PEI, which is frequently 12-13%, seasonal jobs, and the government deciding to teach us a better way. We need help to help ourselves. If you give food, you feed a family. If you teach them to plant, you feed a community. And I have to say, this woman, when we were supposed to meet in Ottawa for the Pathways meeting, I had a death in my extended family, and there was a blizzard, and I couldn't go. I literally couldn't get off the island. Chief Matilda went without me with the poster that I had worked on, and she had me on her iPad, and she took me all around the meeting as a disembodied head. And she'd be walking up the stairs going, we're going upstairs now, Jen, to the meeting. And I had people coming over and going, hi, who are you? And I go, I'm on the grant with Chief Matilda. And she absolutely didn't bat an eye. So I have every confidence that this is going to be a success. I have a lot to learn. And I certainly want to acknowledge our partners, particularly the CIHR funding. So thank you very much.
Fascinating presentations. I really enjoyed them. If you see me working on my tablet, that's because I'm looking up things on the StatsCan website to say, hey, haven't you heard about this data from StatsCan? So I have to come see some of you with some data tables for you. And I'm here for the next 2 days if anyone wants to come up and ask me about StatsCan data. That's why I'm here. I'm also here to promote the use of the 2015 Nutrition Survey. I'm the survey manager for the Canadian Community Health Survey on nutrition. I've noticed some of these presentations, the ones at lunchtime, for example, excuse me, were started off with setting the tone, setting the environment of where we are nutritionally, like the beverage data that was used at lunch today. That was all 2004 CCHS nutrition data. So what we're doing is a repeat in 2015. Pretty much the same thing. Unfortunately, with budget cuts, we have a slightly smaller sample, but hopefully we'll be able to do much of the same research and invite people through the Research Data Center program to get their hands on the 2015 data. It should be available in the RDCs towards the end of 2016, perhaps early 2017. Last time around, we released the 2004 in 3 different waves. The intention this time around is to do it in one shot because we're a little farther ahead on the processing than we were before. So hopefully get more timely data out to the research community. That's what we intend to do. Also, if anyone is using Statistics Canada data and has some comments, I'm mostly interested on the nutrition survey, of course, but I work very closely with my colleagues down the hall in the annual survey and also the CHMS, the Health Measures Survey. And we have within our division meetings where all the analysts get together and talk about data coherence and best practices and good things like that. So if you want to give me some comments to send back to my fellow colleagues down the hall, that's all good too. What else would I like to say? Yes, please use our data. And I'll help you use the data. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry to put you on the spot, but that was